This is Dirshu Mishnah Berurah. I'm going to be continuing Simin Lamed Beis, and we're going to be learning Sif Yud Gimel through the middle of Sif Tesvav today. Apologies on the lateness of today's shiur, but let's get to it. So it says the Mechaber in Sif Yud Gimel, Yeheya Klav Shalim. The cloth, the parchment in which you're creating for your stam, should be complete. There should not be holes inside the cloth. That if there's a hole, that the ink does not pass over it, that is the issue. Dahainu. Now the Mechaber explains what is he referring to by this hole. Dahainu. The letter should not appear like it is split. Into two. So we're learning an interesting halach over here, in which when you have your cloth, if there were to be a hole, a crack in the cloth, we're afraid that the ink is going to go into that hole, and thereby the letter will not appear complete. Before we see a picture, of course, showing what this means, the Mishnah Berurah over here says, Sif 13-15a, that you don't want the letter to look as if it is two. Moving over to the next page of Mishnah Berurah. Shukatan kol kach, add that if the hole is so small, when you pass over on it with the quill, the hole is filled up with ink, and the hole is not felt by the quill. That is not a problem. So if it's a very teeny hole that as you're writing, all it does is the ink just falls into that hole and you can continue writing, it's not a problem. Even though one might think maybe a dot of the ink falls into that area. And if you were to take this piece of parchment and you were to hold it up to the sun, you hold it up into the light, then you would see a little bit of hole. So maybe that little bit, when looked upon it very, very carefully, that is an issue. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that is okay, that is kosher. But let's say you have a hole, a larger hole, a hole to the extent that the kulmes, the ink does not just pass over it. It's possible. What's the reason? Because the letter appears split into two via it. And even if the hole is in the middle of the thickness of the letter, in the roof, the top, and therefore what? There's one little hole in the middle of the letter, and there's ink all around that hole, so you can still see. It's still possible. And the Mishnah continues, it says, maybe it's in the corner, so you can see the complete letter. Still, it's a problem. But says Mishnah Berurah, as we've seen many times, this is before you write the letter. Let's say you wrote the letter and everything was fine, and then then the letter got split into half through the hole. Then we could look, is there the tzura, is the appearance of the letter until the hole? Kasha will be kosher. And we will get to. So let's now go right away. I know what has happened. Yeah, let's go right away into the pictures over here to understand what's going on. As you see over here in this picture, it's showing you that there's this teeny little hole in your parchment, and you can't even tell there's a hole. But when you hold it up to the sun, you can see the hole. That is the case that it's going to be okay. And we continue over here in the pictures in which we see that the directive is to have a complete parchment without any cracks. And the issue is, because if there's a crack, as you write with it, what might happen? Your letter is going to be missing a bit. But continue the Mishnah Berurah, and he taught us that if you're writing, and if as you're writing, there's no problem at all, that's fine. But if as you're writing there's a little hole, even though the letter is recognizable, it's fully surrounded by the hole, that's still going to be a problem. We continue in the pictures over here, quoting the Mishnah Berurah, in which he shows us a beautiful picture of what we just spoke about, that if there's this teeny hole, and when you write your letter, you can't even see that hole, and when you hold it up to the sun, then you'll notice the hole, that is when the Mishnah Berurah said it's going to be okay. But if there's a hole again, that as you write, it appears in the letter, even if it's completely surrounded by the ink, even if it's in the leg and you can completely see the letter, it's still going to be a problem. But to continue the Mishnah Berurah, he taught us that if after you write it was complete, and then later on it was a crack, later on there was a hole, then we consider it whether you could tell that it is the letter with or not. Continues the Mishnah Berurah in Sif in Sif Yod Dalit. Ha Seifrim has reason. The Seifrim who are Zrizim, they are alacrious. What do? They create 3 types of parchment. Ha'av Yisr, the thickness parchment, lichtu by Parsha Shema, to write the Parsha of Shema Shikatana, which is the shortest Parsha. V'adak mimenu, and the thinner one, the Parsha Vayim Shemaya, Shi Yisr Gedayla. The Parsha Kadim, the Parsha Vayim Kevecha, Sheim Arucha is Oisim, Klaf Dak Ma'oid. You make even a thinner Parsha. Why? Because then as you roll up the klaf, it's all going to be the same amount. So the basic concept here is that each parsha is different length. And if you would write on a piece of parchment equal to the length of the parsha, one would be longer, one would be shorter. When rolled up, one would be thicker, one would be thinner. So the Seifrim or Zrizim create different types of parchment so that they all end up being the same thickness. Says Mishnah Berurah over here, Sif 13-15a, v'dak min al-parsh vayim shemaya. Tal Yisayfer, says Mishnah Berurah. Tzarech lem the parsh vayim kviyacha, shu yisay gedelo. Parshas kadim parsh vayim shema ruchis. Continues Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Rami. The Rami caused Seifrim shalem oisim tikkun acher. The Seifrim did a different thing, not to make the parchment thicker or thinner, but rather shekol ha'klavim shavim. The thickness of all the parchments are equal ba'irich and length. Echad ba'ivi bairech. They will leave a blank paper on the shorter parshas. The pictures over here do a beautiful job as always, showing you what's going on over here. That basically, as you see, the 4 parshas have different lengths. So what they would do is they would make the different klafim, the different parchments, thicker and thinner, so when you wind them up, it would be all equal the same. But the Rami quoted us an interesting idea that some of the Seifrim in his time would do, that what they would do is it would all be the same length, it would all be the same thickness. But what would they do? Depending upon the parsha, they would have more blank space or less blank space, so that it would all end up being the same size after rolled up. Continuing in the Mechaber as we begin Sif Vav, says the Mechaber, if after you wrote, they got a hole inside the letter Hey or Yamem, Kash, even if there's a complete hole, that the hole fills up the entire airspace. Continues the Mechaber, that's the first opinion. But in the Yerushalmi, it is mashma shegam bifnim sarshekam mukav klaf. That even inside a letter, not the letter itself, the ear space within the letter, that as well needs to be surrounded by klaf. Nikiv regel panimi shalei. Let's say the inner leg of the hay as a whole. Afilu inisha menu el kosher zadal left. Kosher la'arash. That is kosher according to the Rosh. So we're going to leave the Ramah Mir Tashem for tomorrow's shir. So let's begin and let's learn some Mishnah Berurah before we see some pictures that clarify exactly what's going on. And again, this all comes from the Mishnah Berurah Pe'er Halach, an absolutely incredible source. And we're also going to be sending out a Mir Tashem, courtesy of a good friend of ours, Rabbi Sibra, who sent in from Dirshu a beautiful synopsis of every sif over here. We'll be sending it out via WhatsApp. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to receive it as well. Says the Shabbos of Gotan Lamedal Lachar Shenichta V'Chulu Naktim Shtei Akdamois V'Ach and Nevar Bezer Hashem Yisbarach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, first I'm going to give you two introductory remarks, and then I'm going to explain what's going on. Aleph, number 1. Every letter needs to appear like that letter. V'im Lav, Pasul. And with regard to this halacha that the letter has to appear by its own letter, if a letter doesn't look like the letter it's supposed to be, it's irrelevant when that issue happened. Whether it happened pre or post writing, if the letter does not look complete, the letter does not look like the letter, it's always a problem. Number 1. Number 2, base. Second akdama. Any letter that the parchment does not surround him for the 4 sides of the parchment, psula is pasul. So in this second din of our akdama, there are 2 details, the din being that the letter has to be surrounded by parchment. Detail number 1, Aleph, the first white line of the Mishnah Berurah. It's only if it was not completely surrounded at the time of writing. If after you wrote the letter, so now we're seeing that in this din, the second din is different than the first din. The first din, that the letter has to be looking like the letter, it doesn't make a difference when it happens. The second din, that you have to have the letter surrounded by parchment, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's only when you write it. But if after you write it was written properly, and then afterwards there is a hole next to the letter on the outside of Adizayna, now it's no longer surrounded by parchment, since it was written by kashrus, it remains kosher. As we're going to get to tomorrow in Mirza Hashem. And the second detail of this din of mukav kavil being surrounded by parchment base, most paiskim hold does not have to be surrounded by a parchment, rak mibachotz leoisiois, on the outside, not inside the letters. Chotz, and that was what the saw in the Machaber. Except for Yerushalmi, which is the second opinion in the Machaber, Shemachmer Bazeh, that you need to have even inside the letter being complete. So those are the two Akdamais. We could call it 1 and 2a and 2b. Now I can explain the Shulchan Aruch. That if after you wrote it, explains the Mishnah Berurah. Hatam, as we just explained inside the letter, we can envision a letter hey. In the inside of that hey, we just learned that most paiskim hold you do not need it to be surrounded by parchment. If there's a hole in the inside, even before you wrote, it's kosher. That which the Mechaber said it's after you wrote, because the Chatzchila you should not write, even if there's a hole in the middle of the airspace, it doesn't fully fill it up. And Mavar v'kasa afilu mayanekev koidem shenechtav still can be kosher ve'ein tzarich sham taken. Continues the Mishnah Berurah explaining the Mechaber, in which he taught us that if after you write the letter in the Achsh Nechtav there's a hole inside the hey or the mem, it's going to be kosher. Says Mishnah Berurah Sif 13-15a. Similarly, other letters that have 3 walls, there's airspace inside the letter, then it's going to be kosher if there's a hole inside of it. But the chaf sofis, the end of chaf, pshuta, v'kol shkein avav u'chadayme, lavteich mikri, avav, chaf sofis, that's not called an inside, and therefore that's part of the surrounding of the letter that always has to be surrounded by parchment. Kol halal continues quoting the Mishnah Berurah that even if it fills up the entire inside airspace, it's going to be kosher according to the first opinion. Even if the hole touches the letter itself, kol shenishar srita dako, this little line mibachotz, as long as the letter is complete, it's kosher. Dein shir lo because it doesn't make a difference how thick the letter is. So even if the hole in the inside touches the letter, it's going to be fine. Shegam bivivnim, but comes the Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi teaches us that no, even inside a letter needs to be surrounded by parchment. Says Mishnah Berurah Sif 13-15a, v'imkein dinam bibachotz, it's the same din. And what's that din? If the hole was there before you wrote it's possible. Ayin etaz b'megadim shem alavashi shlachmer Yerushalmi should be machmer like the Yerushalmi in order to ascertain and be certain that even inside the letters it is whole before writing. All sides and inside. Again, therefore, if there's a hole inside, in the middle, like the hay or the man before you write, that can be surrounded by parchment. You should erase a little bit from the inside, from the inner thickness of the lead, then it will be fully surrounded. And finally, one last Mishnah Berurah said that if the inside letter of the hay has a hole of it, even if there's only a little bit left, the rush is going to hold its kosher. Nik. A little bit of race, and it's not all. Stop the letter hey, there's a little bit left. Why? There's no shear of the little leg that has to be hanging down. Because it has a teeny little leg. Rush. Small din, other letters, both legs have the same din, and therefore the din of the rush would not apply. Before we call it a day, let's take one more moment to understand this din that we just saw. As you see in this picture, you see the letter Hey, you see the letter Mem, and these are complete full letter He's and Mem. And you see that we're referring to is that if you can have a little hole inside the letter, that is going to be the potential machlekes for the two diyas in the machaber. You see him showing that you could scratch it off in order to show that it's fully, the letter is fully surrounded, etc. And finally, you see over here portraying that the leg has a no shear. But when it comes to the letter Chaf and the letter Vav, then of course you would have an issue because that's part of the letter itself. And we'll pick up B'siyata D'Shmaya from the rest of Sif 13-15a in the next year.